In the winter of 1297, as snow pressed against the stone walls of Edinburgh Castle, the north wind screamed across the battlements and poured through every gap with the cruelty only a medieval winter could deliver. Yet inside those walls, hundreds of men, women and servants had to sleep, eat and work without the luxuries of heating, insulation or modern comforts that we take for granted today. The night of January 14 is preserved in guard accounts from the garrison describing bitter cold so intense that water jugs froze solid in the great hall and breath drifted like smoke in the darkness. Nevertheless, the people living within that fortress survived the freezing temperatures night after night. Their ability to do so was not accidental, but the product of centuries of social engineering, architectural adaptation, and practical survival knowledge that shaped medieval life across Europe, and reveals how humans learned to endure cold long before the invention of central heating. To understand how medieval people slept without freezing inside castles, we must first understand the nature of castle architecture. A medieval castle was not designed for comfort, but for military survival, with walls sometimes 3 meters thick, small windows, arrow loops, and large empty interiors filled with stone that absorbed cold rather than blocked it. Even wealthy nobles with tapestries and feather mattresses slept in conditions that today would feel close to unbearable for most people. Winter nights often dropped below freezing, and those inside castle chambers relied on more than just fireplaces to get through until dawn, because fireplaces, while iconic, were structurally inefficient. Most of the heat rose directly up the chimney, leaving rooms smoky, drafty, and unevenly heated. Thus the typical winter night inside a medieval castle involved a combination of clothing, bedding, social sleeping patterns, and architectural solutions that worked together to maintain warmth. The first layer of survival was clothing. Medieval clothing was not simply fashion, but a defensive system against the cold. Nobility and peasants alike used multiple layers because wool, linen, and fur were some of the best insulators known to the medieval world. A noblewoman might sleep wearing a soft linen shift under a long woolen gown with a fur-lined mantle laid over her feet, while common soldiers might wear tunics, hose, cloaks, and even their padded gambesons, which, though meant for battle, acted as remarkably effective insulation. The idea of sleeping nude or lightly dressed is a modern invention. Medieval people viewed the body as vulnerable to cold and even to supernatural harm at night. Therefore, layering remained common practice. Medieval physicians, such as those writing in the Trotula manuscripts, emphasized retaining body heat as essential to healthy sleeping, and thick night coverings were considered medicinal as well as practical. The second key factor was bedding. Medieval beds were far more complex than simple frames with a mattress castle. Occupants slept on thick mattresses stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers with woolen blankets stacked in layers, and furs placed on top for insulation. Archaeological evidence from English, French, and German castles shows that many families slept together on shared bedding, not just for social reasons, but for warmth. Body heat created a microclimate within the shared bed, making it significantly warmer than the surrounding castle chamber. Noble beds, especially canopy beds, served a critical function. The heavy curtains that surrounded them were not only decorative but acted as a miniature room within a room. The thick fabric trapped warm air and blocked cold drafts, turning the bed into a small insulated chamber. Even when the rest of the room remained icy, the medieval term for this was a bedspace chamber, and it was common for both nobles and soldiers, though in different forms. Nobles used fine fabric, while soldiers hung rough woolen curtains around their straw beds in the barracks, creating the same protective cocoon of warm air. The next layer of survival came from fire technology. Although open hearths and fireplaces were inefficient, they were still central to heating strategies. Large halls often kept a fire burning continuously through winter nights, and the heat rising into the rafters created a warm zone near the central gathering area, where servants, guards, and castle staff often slept. Nobles slept in private chambers. They too relied on strategic heating using braziers. Portable metal fire bowls that burned embers and charcoal braziers were especially effective because they radiated heat slowly through the night. However, they posed a significant risk of suffocation, and castle records include warnings about closing chamber doors too tightly when a brazier was burning. Despite these dangers, they remained popular across Europe, from the Mediterranean to England and Scandinavia. Medieval heating also included bed warmers, flat metal pans filled with hot coals dragged between layers of bedding shortly before sleep. Though these were risky, they created a pocket of warmth that could last for hours, making them an essential part of noble nighttime routines. Architecture added another level of defense. Medieval builders understood airflow, heat retention, and insulation in practical terms. If not scientific, the thick stone walls of castles, while cold, acted as stabilizers, preventing rapid temperature loss, and once interior spaces accumulated heat, the stone helped hold it for longer periods. Castle builders also designed sleeping quarters, strategically locating them away from the outer walls, whenever possible, in inner towers, upper floors, and side chambers where drafts were fewer. Spiral staircases, narrow corridors, and wooden interior paneling all helped limit cold air movement. Wooden floors and wall panels especially improved insulation, significantly transforming stone rooms into spaces that retained warmth more effectively. Many surviving castles show evidence of wooden cladding added after the initial construction, demonstrating that medieval occupants improved insulation as they better understood the winter challenges of life inside stone walls. Another factor often overlooked is the social structure of castle life. Medieval people rarely slept alone. Isolation was considered dangerous, not only spiritually but physically. Household roles from English and French castles show that servants, squires, guards, and retainers shared beds with one another or slept in close packed chambers. The warmth generated by multiple bodies in a room could raise the temperature enough to prevent freezing, and the presence of others offered protection from nighttime dangers, whether human or supernatural. Nobles, although more private, still kept attendants, pages, or companions sleeping on pallets within their chambers. The idea of a solitary person sleeping in an enormous cold room is largely a modern romantic image. Medieval reality was fundamentally communal, shaped by necessity rather than preference. Court life chronicles describe even kings sleeping in heated chambers with several attendants nearby, and the warmth of these shared spaces was one of the most reliable shields against the winter cold. Finally, the medieval mind set itself contributed to survival. Castle life was governed by routine and expectations. People were accustomed to cold in a way that modern society rarely experiences. Chronic exposure to outdoor labor, limited access to heated rooms, and thick wool garments created a physiological and psychological tolerance that shaped how medieval communities endured winter, what we might consider unbearable cold. They viewed as a normal seasonal challenge. Writing from the 13th and 14th centuries often treats winter discomfort as an expected reality, not a crisis, and practical knowledge about warming beds, layering clothes, managing drafts, and grouping sleepers was passed down through generations, forming a cultural memory of winter survival that helped entire populations endure harsh climates from the British Isles to the Alps. And beyond this combination of social habits, architectural choices, clothing traditions, and bedding technology enabled medieval people not only to survive but to sleep through the winter inside stone fortresses without freezing. Their ingenuity remains a testament to the resilience of pre-modern societies, who built lives around the constraints of their environment and used every resource available to stay alive and functional, even on the coldest nights, within the walls of their castles. By the early 14th century, the cold realities of castle life were shaping not only daily routines but long-term architectural and social evolution. And nowhere is this clearer than in the winter of 1325 at Château de Vincennes, where chroniclers describe a particularly harsh season that pushed even French nobility to the limits of endurance. The bitter cold forced the entire household from the outer chambers into more insulated inner rooms, and revealed the true struggle faced by medieval people trying to sleep inside massive stone structures. The experience at Vincennes serves as a window into the broader world of medieval Europe, where winter survival was a carefully learned craft built upon centuries of practice, experimentation, and adaptation. The people who lived in these fortresses were not passive victims of the cold but active problem solvers, using technology, tradition, and sheer resilience to stay alive through some of the harshest winters on record to understand the full picture of how people slept inside castles. It is necessary to examine the deeper architecture of medieval interiors. Stone walls were not bare and exposed, as often imagined. Instead, they were covered with layers of textiles, tapestries, wooden paneling, and painted cloths that worked like primitive insulation. Attempts to warm castle chambers relied heavily on hanging fabrics, because a single tapestry could reduce drafts by dividing a cold chamber into smaller, warmer sections. Archaeologists studying surviving textiles from the Loire Valley and English keeps such as Rochester Castle note how these fabrics were often densely woven and sometimes doubled to increase insulation in nobility. Suites tapestries served not only as decoration, but as a functional heat barrier, keeping cold stone surfaces from leaching warmth from anyone sleeping near. By written accounts from 1002-189 in the household of King Edward, I describe the procurement of heavy wool tapestries specifically for winter months to line sleeping chambers, indicating a deliberate seasonal shift in interior design long before modern heating solutions existed. Even more critical than wall coverings was the placement of the sleeping chambers themselves. Medieval builders understood that the upper floors of keeps and towers were warmer than the lower levels because heat naturally rose while damp drafts settled near the ground. Many castles therefore positioned the lord's bedchamber on the second or third story rather than in ground-level halls. Castle blueprints from across Europe reveal that upper chambers often contained smaller windows, fewer arrow slits, and wooden floors that trapped more warmth. These spaces were intentionally compact compared to the high-ceilinged great halls because smaller rooms were easier to heat at night. Noble families retreated to these private quarters, while their servants occupied the hall or barracks near the central hearth. But even for nobility, warmth was not guaranteed. Architecture provided only partial protection, and sleeping comfortably still depended heavily on bedding, clothing, and fire management. The medieval bed was a sophisticated system designed for warmth, long before comfort became a luxury for most people. The typical noble bed included a wooden frame, ropes stretched like a web to support a mattress, a thick straw, wool, or feather-filled mattress, multiple wool blank, its linen sheets, heavy furs layering on top, and most importantly a canopy with curtain hangings that surrounded the entire structure. These curtains were the heart of medieval heating practice because they trapped heat inside and blocked out drafts, turning the bed into its own chamber within a chamber. The interior environment created by this fabric cocoon could be dramatically warmer than the rest of the room. Medieval texts, from household accounts to romance literature, frequently mention beds as warm, intimate enclosures distinct from the cold world outside. This practice was so effective that even when fireplaces struggled against winter winds, bed curtains kept sleepers insulated through the worst nights. When entire rooms froze, the bed curtain system became one of the most universal solutions across Europe, appearing not just in noble households, but in urban homes and monasteries, showing that it was a widespread medieval technology rather than a luxury reserved for elite castle life. Clothing also played a crucial role at night. Medieval nightwear was functional and layered, combining linen shifts, long woolen robes, and fur mantles for both men and women. Commoners used thick cloaks as night coverings. Soldiers sleeping in castle garrisons wore their padded gambesons, soft linen, and wool armor that functioned perfectly as cold weather bedding. Some accounts from the 100 Years' War note that soldiers preferred gambesons at night because they retained heat better than regular clothing while being comfortable enough to sleep. In Northern Europe saw even heavier night apparel, including the use of fur-lined caps, socks, and mittens, which were considered normal rather than unusual in winter. Illustrations from manuscripts such as the Luttrell Psalter depict medieval people sleeping under multiple blankets while wearing full nightclothes, emphasizing that warmth required continuous layering from head to toe. The modern idea of lightweight indoor clothing simply did not exist in the medieval world, where most structures were only partially heated at best. Thus clothing was not only a daytime necessity, but a primary survival tool during winter nights. The social dimension of medieval sleeping arrangements was equally important because Warmth was a communal effort. Nobles slept with attendants near. By merchants and craftsmen shared beds with apprentices, castle servants crowded into side chambers, and soldiers slept shoulder to shoulder in barracks. The communal sleeping arrangements preserved body heat, creating a warm zone that resisted the cold far better than isolated sleeping. Could medieval society viewed this closeness as both normal and necessary, the idea of private bedrooms for each individual was virtually non-existent, except for extremely high-ranking nobility. Everyone else slept in groups. Families shared one bed or multiple pallets. Soldiers slept in lines near fireplaces, and servants slept near their masters as both guard and emergency support. This closeness also reflected the medieval understanding of warmth as a shared responsibility and winter survival as a communal task. Fire remained the center of medieval winter life. Open hearths in great halls produced immense heat, but their effects were limited by the height of the ceilings and the constant airflow from doors and arrow slits. To compensate, castles employed multiple heating devices. Braziers placed in corners or near beds burned charcoal. Embers through the night. Tower chambers often used smaller fireplaces designed to retain more heat with thick masonry that held warmth long after the flames died down. Medieval heating required vigilance because fires needed tending through the night, and careless management led to smoke suffocation or accidental burns. Castle staff responsible for maintaining fires were essential to household survival during winter nights, and records from English, French, and Italian strongholds highlight the importance of fire tenders, whose duties included managing embers, sealing shutters, and ensuring no chamber fell dangerously cold. Fire technology also included clever tools such as foot stoves, wooden boxes with heated coals placed under cloth to warm a sleeper's feet, and bed warmers, metal pans filled with hot coals that heated blankets before the occupants climbed. In these techniques, the simple provided enough heat to sustain a bed well through the night. Another key survival technique was environmental awareness. Medieval people structured their evenings around preserving warmth. They closed shutters early in the day, sealed draft points with cloth, kept doors shut between chambers, and avoided unnecessary trips outside after dusk. Bedding was shaken and layered carefully to prevent cold pockets. Heated stones were sometimes wrapped in cloth to act as primitive hot water bottles, and even animals played a role. Dogs, cats, and in rare cases small livestock slept in human chambers, adding both warmth and early warning of danger. While this practice may seem extreme today, it reflects the medieval acceptance of practical solutions over aesthetic concerns. People were intimately aware of the daily battle against cold and shaped their routines around minimizing its impact. By the time they crawled into bed each night, they had already performed a series of tasks designed to trap every bit of heat available. The medieval world you shaped expectations about cold even further. People simply accepted that living conditions were harsh and that surviving winter required discipline and preparation. Discomfort was normal, resilience was expected, and a cold chamber was not seen as a failure of architecture, but as an inherent part of life. In a world without modern heating, what might shock modern sensibilities was routine for medieval communities. Their tolerance for cold was significantly higher because their exposure was constant and lifetime long, and this hardiness influenced how they slept, dressed, and behaved in winter months. By combining layered clothing, enclosed bedding, strategic architecture, communal sleeping, and careful fire management, medieval people successfully endured winters that by all modern standards should have been intolerable. Their techniques reveal a complex understanding of environment and adaptation, showing that even without scientific knowledge, they developed systems that kept them alive through some of the coldest nights in European history. The struggle against winter shaped not only personal survival, but the cultural rhythms of medieval life, influencing castle design, household structure, and social norms in ways still visible in surviving architecture throughout Europe today. By the middle of the 15th century, winter life inside castles had become an intricate seasonal operation shaped by tradition, necessity, and the learned experience of generations who had grown up within the rhythms of cold seasons. The struggle for warmth was not merely physical, but deeply tied to medieval culture, society, and even politics, because the ability to keep a household warm signaled organizational strength, authority, and competence. One of the clearest illustrations comes from the winter of 1453 at Warkworth Castle in Northumberland, where the Percy family prepared for bitter storms. Rolling in from the North Sea chroniclers detail how in early December servants hauled extra firewood into the great hall tapestries were rehung to seal draught points, and bed curtains embroidered with family crests were brought out from storage to prepare for the cold months ahead. These preparations were not unique to Warkworth, but were part of a broader winter readiness cycle practiced across Europe in castles large and small, showing how essential warmth was to survival and social order in the medieval world. Central to this cycle was the understanding that winter was both predictable and dangerous. Medieval households timed work festivals and political movements around seasonal shifts, because cold affected everything from travel to diplomacy to military campaigns. The drive to secure warmth each night was therefore deeply embedded in planning and governance. Castle stewards were responsible for ensuring that firewood stores were full before the first frost, and nobles kept detailed records of fuel consumption, knowing that a shortfall could lead to discomfort, unrest, illness, or in extreme cases, death. Firewood, charcoal, and peat were valued winter commodities, and managing them required logistical expertise. Accounts from castles in France, Scotland, and Denmark show that households often consumed massive quantities of fuel for heating, especially in communities with large retinues. Winter survival was thus a matter of preparation, not luck, and the ability of a lord to maintain warm chambers reflected his capability as a leader. Household roles from 1004 in the service of Henry Roman IV describe precise allocations of firewood to different parts of the castle, including the Queen's Chamber, the Great Hall, and the barracks, demonstrating a carefully regulated system designed to protect the entire household from the cold. For nobility, warmth also intersected with status because sleeping arrangements reflected hierarchy. The warmest chambers were reserved for the lord and lady, positioned deep inside the keep, where walls were thickest and drafts weakest. Near their rooms were the attendants and high-ranking servants who provided not only support but retained some of the heat radiating from noble chambers. The further one moved from the center of authority, the colder the sleeping conditions became. Soldiers slept in communal barracks with minimal insulation, small fireplaces, and straw bedding, while grooms, cooks, and other servants occupied peripheral rooms where cold drafts from the outer walls were unavoidable. This hierarchy of warmth mirrored the social order and underscored the reality that medieval life was stratified even in the basic experience of sleeping through winter nights. Diaries from noblewomen such as Margaret Paston mention the discomfort of cold chambers even among the wealthy, while accounts from castle soldiers describe nights when water froze inside their helmets and breath formed frost on their blank. It's the distribution of heat within a castle reveals much about medieval expectations and values. Warmth was a privilege, but also a communal resource carefully managed through tradition and necessity. The psychological aspect of winter sleeping practices is equally important. Medieval people viewed cold differently than modern societies. Discomfort was normal and even expected, and surviving winter became a collective effort that shaped identities from childhood onward. Children were raised in cold environments, learning early how to layer clothing, shake bedding, manage shutters, and sleep near others for warmth. The culture expected toughness and self-reliance, yet also valued the shared knowledge of winter survival. Rituals in castle communities. Older servants instructed younger ones in the proper way to bank fires, fold furs, close draft windows, and heat stones and coals for night use. These rituals were passed down like essential life skills, forming a cultural memory that defined winter survival as a shared responsibility rather than an individual burden. This mindset is evident in medieval literature, where scenes of winter hardship emphasize endurance, communal warmth, and the importance of household unity against the cold. The physical design of sleeping spaces continued to evolve as medieval builders gained experience with the realities of winter architecture. The transition from early medieval great halls to more complex multi-room castles was driven in part by the need for better temperature control. Private chambers allowed heat to be concentrated, eliminating the inefficiency of trying to warm a massive hall. Each night, castles increasingly featured wooden wainscoting, which both reduced drafts and created a more stable temperature throughout the winter months in some regions, especially in Northern and Central Europe. Builders experimented with underfloor heating systems inspired by ancient Roman hypocausts. Although rare, these systems demonstrate that medieval architects were not unaware of advanced heating principles, but limited by resources and geography. The more common practice was layering architecture with tapestries, screens, and wooden partitions creating moat. I layered thermal barriers that reflected deep empirical understanding of airflow and insulation. Medieval castle builders may not have used scientific terminology, but their practical designs show a remarkable grasp of environmental management. Nighttime fire management was another critical practice because the difference between a well-maintained fire and a failing one could determine whether a room remained livable. Guards and servants assigned to hearth duty monitored embers throughout the night using iron pokers to control burn rate and ensure the fire remained stable without producing excessive smoke. Some castle households used hour timing systems, such as burning marked candles to guide when fires should be stirred, or logs replaced. The careful management of fire was both an art and a safety measure. Because many castle disasters began when unattended fires ignited wooden beams, tapestries, or bedding to reduce the risks, some castles relied more heavily on braziers, which provided slow, steady heat, but also required careful handling to avoid carbon buildup or accidental burns. This constant need for fire supervision created an entire category of servants whose expertise kept the household alive during winter nights. A fact often overlooked in romanticized portrayals of castle life. Beyond architecture, bedding, and fire, practical winter survival also depended on nutrition and health. Medieval people understood that food influenced warmth, and winter diets emphasized calorie-heavy dishes that sustained energy through long cold nights. Castle kitchens produced thick stews, barley porridges, meat pies, and hearth-baked breads that helped the body retain heat. Spices, when available, were believed to warm the blood and appear frequently in winter records among wealthy households, while poorer communities relied on root vegetables, salted meats, and dairy products to endure harsh months. Although medieval nutritional science was rudimentary, the connection between food and warmth was widely recognized. Households timed meals to support nighttime survival, often providing heavier dinners to prepare the body for the cold hours ahead. Castle infirmaries treated winter illnesses with herbal remedies, fur-lined bedding, and heated stones, showing a practical, although limited, understanding of health and warmth maintenance. The relationship between diet, health, and sleep reveals that winter survival was not only about environmental control, but also about the physical resilience of the people inside the castle walls. Animals contributed to winter survival as well. Castle dogs slept at the foot of beds for warmth, while cats were welcomed both for pest control and the heat they generated. Larger animals, such as horses and oxen, were kept in stables that shared structural walls with the castle interior. The radiant warmth from these animals helped warm adjacent rooms, particularly in smaller fortifications where space was limited. The presence of animals inside or near human sleeping quarters may seem unhygienic to modern sensibilities, but in the medieval world, practicality outweighed aesthetics, and warmth was more valuable than cleanliness during the coldest months. This cooperation between humans and animals was part of a broader winter ecosystem, where every source of heat was utilized to support survival. All of these practices, clothing, bedding, architecture, communal living, fire management, nutrition, and animal proximity, formed an interlocking system that allowed medieval people to sleep through freezing winters inside stone castles. What might appear primitive today was in fact a highly efficient adaptation shaped by necessity and perfected through centuries of trial, tradition, and experience. These practices reveal a medieval society that understood its environment intimately, working with its limitations and resources to create livable spaces in climates that posed constant challenges. Winter survival in castles reflects a broader truth about the medieval world. Ingenuity, resilience, and communal cooperation shaped daily life in ways that modern narratives often overlook, and the people who endured those long cold nights did so with methods far more advanced and thoughtful than they are often given credit for. By the beginning of the 16th century, when late medieval castles were gradually giving way to early Renaissance fortresses, the question of how people managed to sleep through winter nights without freezing had become more than a practical challenge. It had become a defining feature of European domestic life, the daily struggle against cold-shaped architecture, technology, social customs, and even political authority across kingdoms from England to Bohemia, and from France to the Scandinavian territories. The winter of 1005, recorded in the household accounts of Alnwick Castle, stands as one of the clearest proofs of how deeply winter management was embedded in the structure of castle life. That season frost coated the inner courtyards for nearly 10 weeks, the kitchen wells iced over, and the wind pouring through the arrow loops of the curtain wall was described as sharp enough to cut breath. Yet within the bedchambers of nobles, servants, and soldiers, people continued to survive and even thrive following traditions perfected over centuries. The harshness of this winter provides a final lens through which we can understand not only the mechanics of sleeping in medieval castles, but also the cultural, psychological, and historical meaning behind their winter survival. The most striking element revealed by the Alnwick records is the precision of household winter planning. Each member of the castle staff had defined duties to ensure nightly warmth. The steward oversaw fuel reserves. The chamberlain inspected bed hangings and linen, the fire tenders monitored embers throughout the night, and the kitchen staff coordinated winter meals designed to preserve heat within the body. Winter was not a background condition, but a seasonal campaign requiring discipline and coordination. Firewood was weighed, measured, and rationed according to rank and function. The Lord's chamber might receive enough wood for a full night burn, while upper servants were allotted larger evening fires, but smaller midnight allocations. Meanwhile, barracks fires were maintained in cycles, so that soldiers could rotate closer or further from the heat depending on duty. This structured approach ensured that no section of the castle fell dangerously cold, and highlights how winter survival was built into the administrative machinery of castle life. The nightly routines of medieval households were therefore not haphazard reactions to weather, but carefully cultivated systems refined over generations. Sleeping technology continued to evolve as well. Late medieval beds grew larger, higher, and more enclosed. Canopy frames became heavier with thicker curtains, trapping even more heat within private chambers. Nobles added layers of interior woodwork that reduced the thermal exposure of stone walls, and craftsmen developed ever denser wool blankets lined with fur or padded with stitched layers of linen. Quilts provided yet another barrier against cold, and were common in both noble and middle-class households. This layered bedding system meant that even when ice formed on the inside surfaces of castle windows, people remained warm within their insulated sleeping cocoons. Accounts from English, French, and Burgundian castles repeatedly mention that entering a noble bed through its curtains felt like stepping into a separate world, warmer, darker, quieter, and protected from the drafts that dominated most castle interiors. The bed was not merely furniture, but an engineered survival space representing medieval ingenuity at its finest. Common people within the castle walls relied on similar principles, although with more modest materials. Soldiers and servants slept on straw pallets, refreshed throughout the winter to prevent dampness, a critical danger, because moisture magnified cold dramatically. These pallets were often raised on wooden boards to keep them off the floor where drafts were strongest. Communal sleeping remained widespread, especially in garrisons where body heat kept the air noticeably warmer than in larger unoccupied chambers. The practice of lining barracks with woolen screens or hanging blankets along the walls spread across European castles in the late medieval period, creating a physical barrier that acted as insulation. Written accounts from the garrisons of Caernarfon and Stirling describe winter barracks arranged in rows of straw beds, separated by personal cloaks, shields, and equipment, serving as primitive partitions that blocked airflow. The soldiers themselves considered these setups normal part of their winter routine, demonstrating a cultural acceptance of practicality over aesthetics. Another critical but often forgotten factor in winter survival was knowledge passed down through experience. medieval people understood the behavior of cold in ways that came from living in uninsulated environments generation after generation. They knew how to test shutters for gaps, how to hang wet cloths where they would freeze, worst, how to choose sleeping positions that best distributed warmth. Children learned these practices early, watching parents shake out bedding, place warming stones properly, and check tapestries for loose edges. The knowledge base was enormous, but informal, woven through the routines of daily life, rather than written in formal manuals. Heating practices were taught through habit, apprenticeship, and family tradition. This cultural memory ensured that even during unexpectedly harsh winters, medieval people were prepared to adapt their behavior, quickly reinforcing one of the most important truths about medieval survival, that winter was understood not as a threat, but as a familiar adversary that demanded respect and preparation. The symbolic role of warmth in medieval society also shaped how winter sleeping practices evolved. Warmth was a sign of wealth, stability, and power. Nobles demonstrated prestige not only through feasts, hunts, or pageantry, but through their ability to keep households warm throughout the winter. A warm bedchamber was a statement of authority because it implied abundant resources, strong management, skilled servants, and an organized estate. The ability to heat stone walls on a freezing January night sent a message about the competence and legitimacy of the lord who presided over the castle. Warmth therefore played a subtle but real role in governance, social control, and household morale. Castle servants who slept warm were more productive. Soldiers who recovered well through the night were more effective on patrol, and visiting guests who experienced comfort despite brutal weather carried impressions that influenced alliances, marriages, and political negotiations. Warmth was not an afterthought, but a political commodity. The limits of medieval heating technology also tell us much about the mindset of the era. Castles were not designed to eliminate cold, but to manage it. Medieval people expected to be cold, but they viewed the goal as maintaining survivable comfort rather than pursuing absolute warmth. This pragmatic acceptance influenced sleeping habits profoundly. People built their lives around routines that made cold manageable rather than attempting to fight it directly. Medieval relationship with cold weather therefore reflected a philosophical world view that saw nature as something to navigate rather than conquer. This explains why castle builders continued to rely on thick stone, massive rooms, and high ceilings, designs that modern architects might consider inefficient but which medieval people considered appropriate because buildings served political, defensive, and social functions ahead of comfort. In this context, winter warmth was created through adaptability rather than architectural perfection, demonstrating the deeply intertwined nature of medieval culture and environment.